One cafe, Vienna, 1910. At one table, a psychologist named Alfred Adler is holding court. Across the room, a young Austrian named Adolf is listening. Between them, a chain of mentorship is forming that will, within 4 years, ignite a world war and set the stage for the Holocaust. And the thread running through all of it isn't politics, it isn't nationalism, it's bad science that nobody dared challenge. Today, we're cracking open a document called In 1914, and by the end of this episode, you'll understand how Darwin's unfinished theory created a vacuum that eugenics rushed to fill, how opium-soaked pseudoscience passed as academic breakthrough, and how 4 students of Alfred Adler used those theories to stage revolutions and commit human rights atrocities on a scale the world had never seen. I've got someone here who has gone deep on this material, and I want to start right at the source. Take us into that cafe.
So the document opens with this line that I keep coming back to. In 1914, the world descended into madness, though it did not then know that it had. And what the author is arguing, and this is the provocative part, is that the madness didn't start in 1914. It started decades earlier in the intellectual culture of Europe's cafes and universities, and it was accelerated by something almost nobody talks about in academic histories of this period.
Which is what, exactly?
Narcotics. Widespread, open, recreational use of opiates among the intelligentsia. The document is pretty blunt about it. Freud, Jung, Adler, the leaders of the Socialist International, opium was legal, it was cheap, and it was cherished for what people called its mind-opening powers. And the author argues, you simply cannot do a competent post-mortem on the 20th century without addressing, quote, the opium smoke in the room.
Okay, so this isn't just colourful historical detail. The argument is that the opium was actually shaping the ideas.
Exactly, and here's where it gets neurologically specific. The document draws on what 21st century neuroscience now knows about what happens to the brain under narcotics. Specifically, the default mode network begins to disintegrate. And what's remarkable is that during that disintegration, people universally report feeling more aware, more intellectually capable. But in clinical performance measures, all participants failed. Not some, not a majority, all.
Wait, all of them? That's a pretty extraordinary claim. It is, and the document leans into it hard. The point being made is that the subjective experience of intoxication, that feeling of clarity, of superior cognition, is a neurological illusion. The brain's reward circuitry is being flooded with dopamine and endogenous opioids far beyond anything natural experience produces. And the participants still insist, even after the fact, that their thinking was never better. That's the trap.
So you've got Europe's leading intellectuals, the people literally writing the theories that will shape the 20th century, operating under a chemical illusion of genius.
That's the thesis. And the document applies it most directly to Freud. The argument is that Freud's primary failure wasn't just the content of his theories, it was his methodology. Freud conducted self-analysis under opium intoxication and then treated himself as, quote, everyman. In raw statistical terms, Freud regarded himself as the mean, the standard against which all other human psyches should be evaluated.
Which is a staggering assumption, even without the narcotics.
Right, and the document points out that tendencies toward hypersexuality, paranoia, and delusion are primary features of narcotics addiction, and those features are, quote, replaced in Freud's published research during the period 1905 to 1914. The author's conclusion is that Freud wasn't achieving breakthroughs. He was experiencing a chronically disintegrating default mode network.
That's a genuinely unsettling reframe, because Freud is still taught as foundational. His ideas still circulate.
And that's precisely the problem the document is diagnosing. But before we get to the consequences, we need to talk about Darwin, because the document argues that Freud's failures were downstream of an even larger intellectual collapse, one that happened at the very top of evolutionary theory.
Okay, walk me through that. Because most people think they know the Darwin story, natural selection, survival of the fittest. What's the part we're missing? So here's the part that almost nobody talks about. Darwin, late in his career, actually abandoned natural selection as the primary mechanism of evolution. He replaced it with what he called sexual selection. The idea being that evolution begins at conception, that the combination of DNA from egg and sperm produces a unique individual, and it's in that act of reproduction where biological change actually happens.
Okay, that actually makes a kind of intuitive sense. So why don't we know this? 2 reasons, and they're both kind of fascinating. First, Victorian and Edwardian sensibilities could not tolerate the word sex, even in academic colloquia. You literally could not discuss Darwin's final conclusion in polite company. Second, and this is the more damaging one, atheist scholars refused to bring Darwin down until there was a clear path forward. So instead of re-evaluating his work, accredited academia did what the document calls the human wave, as Darwin's cousin Francis Galton picked up the ball.
And Galton's contribution was eugenics.
Exactly. But here's the logical flaw the document identifies that nobody in the ivory tower dared point out. A species is defined by the ability to reproduce. Darwin's sexual selection hypothesis proposed that one species could become another during the act of procreation. But if species are defined by reproductive compatibility, then sexual selection can't explain new species. It's circular. The document calls it an absurdity of logic.
So Darwin died having never actually found the mechanism he was looking for.
The document says it plainly: Darwin died a failure, but the ivory tower could never acknowledge the fact. And into that vacuum stepped Galton with eugenics, an applied science built on a flawed foundation. The document draws a direct line from Darwin's dying epiphany to the racial hygiene programs of the Third Reich. It calls it, quote, but an arc leap.
That's a heavy phrase, an arc leap, because it implies the connection was almost inevitable once the logic was set in motion.
And the document is careful to say it's not refuting biological change over time. It's making the painful observation that Darwin never found the mechanism by which that change actually happens. The chimpanzee example is striking. The document points out that chimpanzees appear in the fossil record about 50 million years ago and have exhibited no substantial morphological change since. In strict Darwinian terms, that's a species that evolved, past tense, but is not evolving.
Huh. That's one of those observations that sounds almost too simple, but once you sit with it, it's actually kind of destabilizing. Right. And the document uses it to set up the ideological battle that was happening at Café Central in Vienna in 1910. Because by then, you had two competing factions of the Socialist International arguing over the mechanism of human evolution. Trotsky's side insisted human evolution was primarily cognitive, no great physiological innovations between humans and other primates. The National Socialists, including the young Hitler, insisted evolution had to be body, mind, and psyche together. So they were literally debating Darwin's unresolved question and using the answer to justify political programs.
And that's where the document gets really specific about what Café Central actually was. Between 1900 and 1914, it was the most famous café in Vienna, the meeting place of writers, artists, revolutionaries, and expatriates. Trotsky, Freud's circle, and countless Balkan students and exiles all passed through its doors. The document describes it as the unofficial embassy of modernism, psychoanalysis, and avant-garde politics.
And Alfred Adler was holding court there.
Adler, Freud, and Jung all held professorships at Vienna University, and Café Central was where they held after-hours sessions before tables filled with what the document calls adoring chin-scratchers. But Adler's focus was different from Freud's. Where Freud was obsessed with the individual psyche, Adler was obsessed with the social psyche, what he called public consciousness. And that distinction turns out to be enormously consequential.
Because the social psyche is something you can weaponize.
Precisely. And the document traces exactly how that weaponization happened through a chain of 4 people. The document calls it a kill chain: Alfred Adler to Dimitrija Mitrinovich, to Vlado Gajinovic, to Gavrilo Princip, the man who actually pulled the trigger in Sarajevo.
Okay, I want to slow down here because this is the part of the document that I found most surprising. Can you walk us through who Mitrinovich actually was?
So Mitrinovich is born in 1887 in Herzegovina. He starts as a literary voice in South Slavic student journals, symbolist essays, mystical reflections, nationalist literary criticism. He's a true believer in South Slavic independence from Austria-Hungary, but he's also a man who keeps hitting the limits of his medium. He realizes words alone can't generate the shift in consciousness he's after.
So he moves to sculpture, or rather, he becomes a promoter of a sculptor.
Exactly. He attaches himself to Ivan Metrovich, a sculptor whose Kosovo cycle, these massive, monumental figures, was exploding onto the European stage. The document describes the moment Metrovich's work was shown at the Vienna Secession as ground zero for a nationalist aesthetic movement. Critics were calling Metrovich a new Rodin. And Mitrinovich becomes his herald, his promoter, his philosophical interpreter across Rome, Paris, Vienna, and Munich.
And it's during those travels that he encounters Adler.
The document is careful here. It acknowledges the exact meeting isn't documented, but it makes a structurally compelling argument. Mitrinović was in Vienna repeatedly, with specific purpose, clienteling the city's intelligentsia as patrons for his sculptor. He lived in cafes. He thrived in conversational spaces. The document says, quote, "It is inconceivable Mitrinović did not frequent Café Central." And by 1913, his writing had shifted decisively from mythic nationalism toward psychological themes, toward personality formation, toward what the document calls the inner landscape of the individual.
Which is Adlerian vocabulary.
Exactly. And then the institutional evidence kicks in. Within 6 months to a year of arriving in London in 1914, he had to flee because all Slavs became suspect in the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the assassination. Mitrinović had founded the English branch of Adler's International Society for Individual Psychology. The document notes that Adler's International Society did not allow unauthorized national branches. Adler's first wartime lecture tour in Britain occurred in 1915, and he spoke at the newly formed Adler Society led by Mitrinović. That's not a coincidence, that's institutional confirmation.
So Adler knew exactly who Mitrinović was and what he was doing.
The document uses a Harry Potter analogy that I think actually lands. It calls Adler Professor Slughorn, a professor who collected promising young minds, and Mitrinović Tom Riddle, a young man inclined to the incendiary devices of rhetoric, but whom Adler found redeemable under his influence. The document's verdict on Adler is deliberately suspended. Was he a naive mentor or something more culpable? But it quotes the maxim, "You will know a tree by the fruit it bears."
And the fruit was pretty rotten.
The document says exactly that. Now, the next link in the chain is Gajinović, and this is where it gets operationally specific. Vlado Gajinović is born in 1890, 3 years younger than Mitrinović. Their intellectual circles overlapped most intensely during the 1908 to 1911 period when both were embedded in the Herzegovinian literary radical milieu. Gajinović was a university-trained thinker, not a street radical. He received a scholarship from the Serbian government to study philosophy at the University of Vienna from autumn 1910 to summer 1912.
So he's in Vienna at exactly the same time Mitrinović is moving through Vienna promoting Mestrovic's exhibitions. And not just in Vienna generally, he was physically present during the months when Mestrovic's works were being shown, deeply embedded in South Slavic student circles, the very people who attended those exhibitions en masse. The document notes that major exhibits at the Secession rarely ran less than 2 months. So you're talking about a sustained period when Slavic national ethos was the dominant conversation at Café Central.
And Gajinović wasn't just absorbing ideas, he was producing them.
This is the part that makes him genuinely dangerous. In 1911, while on his Vienna scholarship, Gajinović published an essay called Young Bosnia in a Sarajevo periodical called Prosvjeta. The document describes it as an ideological manifesto which forms the foundational text of the Young Bosnia movement. And the central message? He openly glorifies tyrannicide. He sanctifies self-sacrifice. He frames political assassination as a purifying act. The document calls it the seed Gajinović planted in Princip's imagination.
And Princip is the man who actually shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Right. And the document traces the operational chain carefully. Gajinović himself was not in Sarajevo on the day of the assassination. By 1914, he was in Switzerland, enrolled at the University of Geneva, which the document describes not as an alma mater, but as a political disguise. Geneva gave him a legal identity, a residence permit, access to international mail, and a safe base for correspondence with Bosnia and Serbia. But in the spring of 1914, he was sending letters to the Young Bosnia movement reiterating his thesis on tyrannicide almost word for word.
What did those letters actually say?
The document quotes the core of it. Political assassination is not murder but moral cleansing. The tyrant's death is a sacrificial act. The assassin must be pure, ascetic, and self-annihilating. Liberation requires personal martyrdom, not political negotiation. And then in another letter, he compelled the conspirators of the need for a symbolic act, a single dramatic deed that must be public, visible, and unmistakable, one that would, quote, awaken the conscience of Europe. He didn't specify the target, but he specified the type of act.
That's a pretty fine distinction. I didn't say who, just what kind.
The document doesn't let him off the hook on that. It says, quote, that he reiterated his manifesto via letter does not absolve Gajinović of criminal culpability. And the document makes the point that this was applied Adlerian psychology. Gajinovich was directing his followers to stage a sacrificial outrage that would qualify as tyrannicide in order to outrage the conscience of the leaders guaranteeing European security. He was indoctrinating zealots to strike the spark the Socialist International predicted would lead to global war.
And it worked.
It worked to deadly effect. The operational support, the pistols and grenades, came from the Black Hand, a secret Serbian nationalist organization. The document is careful to distinguish between the inspirational chain and the operational chain. Gajinovich was the ideological architect. The Black Hand was the operational control. But the document's strongest documented link is between Gajinovich and a Serbian officer named Vojislav Tankosic, who multiple historians, including Vladimir Dedijer in The Road to Sarajevo, confirm met Gajinovich personally during his Belgrade University period and later helped arm Princip's Circle, using Gajinovich's ideological standing as justification.
So the ideology was the currency. Gajinovich's credibility as a thinker is what got the weapons flowing.
Exactly. And the document zooms out from there to make the larger argument, because Gajinovich is just one branch of the tree. The document argues that Adler, at Café Central, taught not just one dangerous student, but 4. Mitrinovich, Trotsky, Stalin, and Hitler all absorbed Adlerian ideas about the social psyche, about manipulating public consciousness, and each went on to perpetrate what the document calls great historical outrages of their own.
That's a staggering claim. I mean, connecting Adler to all 4 of those figures.
And the document acknowledges it's a strong claim. But the structural argument is this. All 4 were present in or connected to the intellectual milieu of Café Central. All 4 were operating in an environment where Adler's ideas about social psychology, about how to shape and manipulate collective consciousness, were the dominant intellectual currency. And all 4 went on to use mass psychological manipulation as a tool of political power.
There's a moment in the document I want to bring up here because I think it's one of the most vivid passages. The extinction burst.
Oh, this is a great one. So in behavioral psychology, an extinction burst is what happens when a behavior that used to produce a reward suddenly stops working. The classic example is a lab rat that's learned to press a button for a food pellet. The machine stops delivering pellets. The rat doesn't calmly walk away. It presses the button faster, harder, more often, as if insisting the machine must work if it just tries enough times. That spike in effort before the behavior fades is the extinction burst.
And the document maps that onto Hitler's final hours.
Hitler issuing orders to armies that no longer existed in the final days of the Third Reich, that's the extinction burst. The document calls it almost delicious in its irony, because the Socialist International and the National Socialists had both been trying to engineer an extinction burst in the world's population, to drive the masses to a breaking point that would trigger revolution. And in the end, Hitler himself became the rat.
That's a genuinely chilling image. But I want to push back slightly on one thing, because I think a fair listener might say, look, bad ideas have always existed. Dangerous intellectuals have always existed. What makes this specifically an academic failure rather than just a political one? That's the right question, and it's where the document's thesis really crystallizes. The argument is that the catastrophe wasn't caused by politics. Politics was the delivery mechanism. The catastrophe was caused by the failure of peer review. When hypothesis gets presented to the general public as settled science, without the checks that peer review is supposed to provide, the consequences can be civilizational. And the document traces this pattern not just to 1910, but all the way back to Ibn Sal's optical lens.
Okay, explain that connection, because Ibn Sal feels like a long way from Café Central. So the document's broader argument is that it's charting human history from a single invention, the optical lens, and demonstrating how each new epiphanic discovery creates a wave of cognitive dissonance among the intelligentsia, and that dissonance produces social upheaval and human rights violations. Each threshold prefaces the next, and the consequences grow worse with each cycle. Ibn Sal's lens leads to Galileo's telescope, which leads to Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, which leads to Malthus, then Darwin, then Pasteur, then the 1905 proof that diseases were biological rather than divine punishment.
And 1905 is the point of no return.
The document says it explicitly. From 1905 forward, science would reign supreme among the world's intelligentsia. But almost predictably, the few who were following empirical method were outpaced by those who published pseudoscience in an orgy of intellectual ambition. The divorce between religion and science became final in 1905, and with it went the last institutional check on what could be claimed in the name of science.
So the document is essentially arguing that the Holocaust has an academic genealogy.
That's the thesis, stated plainly. Quote, "The Holocaust should not be attributed to a furious, goose-stepping Nazi, but a fatal flaw within accredited academia which has resulted in great injustices throughout history." And the diagnosis the document offers for why this keeps happening is, I think, the most interesting part. It calls it idolatry.
Idolatry. That's a loaded word.
It is, and the document uses it precisely. When theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of scripture than to manifest truth, that's idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that's also idolatry. The document argues we are all susceptible to it because we define ourselves too much by what we believe. When those beliefs are exposed as fallacies, we resist abandoning them. And what peer review is supposed to do, what every major religion also instructs in the document's framing, is force us to accept that we are our own worst counsel.
That's actually a pretty generous framing of religion and science as doing the same thing, both trying to protect us from our own certainty.
And the document's point is that when either system fails at that function, when the church protects its interpretation rather than the truth, or when the academy protects its hypothesis rather than the evidence, the consequences radiate outward. The substantia nigra is a perfect example of this. In 1786, Félix Vic d'Azyr was the first scientist to identify a dark substance in the stem of the human brain using Ibn Sahl's microscope. He called it the substantia nigra, Latin for the black stuff. There's no fault in that observation. But lesser men drew racist conclusions from it. The document says exactly that. In 1893, Edouard Bressour hypothesized the substantia nigra was the major pathological site in Parkinson's disease, validated in 1919. So by the time Freud was publishing Totem and Taboo in 1914, comparing savages and neurotics, the race was on to identify what role this dark region of the brain played in human cognition. And in that vacuum of knowledge, racist pseudoscience rushed in. The document traces the dumb nigger and angry nigger tropes of early 20th century pseudoscience directly to ignorance surrounding the substantia nigra.
And Freud's Totem and Taboo was feeding directly into that.
The document argues Freud's 1914 publication was just what Hitler's doctor ordered. And it notes that Malthus, Darwin, and Marx all conspired in Freud's stupor to produce what it calls an explicitly racist series of papers which define Freud as the norm and savages and neurotics as deviants. Melanin was the proposed mechanism of action. The document doesn't mince words about what Freud thought of people with more melanin in their skin.
So when you step back from all of this, the opium, Darwin's unresolved theory, Freud's self-projection, Adler's social psychology, the chain from Café Central to Sarajevo, what's the through line? What does the document actually want us to take away?
I think the through line is this. Every time humanity crosses a genuine threshold of knowledge, a real epiphany, the institutions that are supposed to manage that knowledge fail. They fail because the people inside them are human, which means they're susceptible to idolatry, to protecting their own certainty. And when hypothesis gets dressed up as science and handed to the public without the friction of genuine peer review, the public acts on it. Sometimes that means bad policy. Sometimes that means a world war.
And the document is arguing that the pattern is consistent. It's not a one-time failure. It's a recurring structural problem.
13 epiphanic thresholds, the document says it's charting. And with each one, the severity of the resulting upheaval is amplified. The ratchet only turns one way, which is why the document ends where it does, not with the Holocaust itself, but with the moment just before it. Café Central, 1910. The spark hasn't been struck yet, but the document's argument is that by that point, the march toward the Holocaust was nearly complete. All that was needed was someone willing to light the fuse.
And Gachinovich provided the ideology for that fuse.
Gachinovich provided the ideology. Mitrinovich provided the network. Adler provided the psychological framework, and the Black Hand provided the weapons. The document's conclusion is that Alfred Adler, knowingly or not, taught 4 of the most dangerous men of the 20th century how to apply psychology to manipulate the masses. Trotsky, Stalin, Hitler, and through Mitrinovich, the architects of the Sarajevo assassination. The document calls them, collectively, 4 Tom Riddles.
Here's what this really comes down to, and I want to make sure we land this clearly for everyone listening. The document in 1914 is not primarily a history of World War I. It's a diagnosis. It's asking, how does a civilization produce catastrophe at scale? And the answer it gives is not evil people. The answer is failed institutions. That's the heart of it. Darwin's circular logic went unchallenged because the ivory tower couldn't afford to admit the error. Freud's drug-influenced self-analysis got published as universal psychological truth because nobody in his circle had the standing or the courage to say, wait, prove it. Adler's social psychology got weaponized because the discipline was so new, so unregulated, that there was no mechanism to distinguish between a genuine theory and an incitement to revolution. And the people who paid the price for those institutional failures weren't the academics. They were the millions who died in the wars and atrocities that followed.
The document is unflinching about that. It says the socialist holocaust of the 20th century, and it uses that term deliberately, was a human rights catastrophe in slow motion. And it traces every step of that slow motion back to a single invention, Ibn Sal's lens, and the chain of epiphanies that followed, each one creating a new wave of dissonance that the institutions of the day were not equipped to manage.
Which raises the question the document doesn't quite answer but clearly wants us to sit with. Are we doing the same thing right now? Are there hypotheses being dressed up as science today, circulating without genuine peer review friction, that future historians will trace to catastrophes we haven't yet experienced?
The document doesn't name contemporary examples, it's deliberately focused on the historical arc. But the structural warning is clear. The document says, accepting that we are our own worst counsel is the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome, but it must be done. That's not a historical observation, that's a live instruction.
I keep coming back to that image of Café Central. One room, Adler in the corner, Trotsky at another table, a young Hitler soaking it all in from across the room. And somewhere in that same city, Gajinovich is reading Mitrinovich's essays and beginning to believe that a single symbolic act of violence could awaken a continent. All of it downstream from Darwin's unfinished theory and Freud's opium-soaked self-analysis. It's almost too neat to be true, except the document makes the case that it is true.
And the document's final provocation is this. We still haven't resolved Darwin's circular logic. We're still, in the author's words, stuck with a tale of 2 delusions. Natural selection, which Darwin himself abandoned, and sexual selection, which replaced it but contradicts the definition of species. The ivory tower still hasn't sorted it out, which means the ratchet is still turning.
That's a genuinely unsettling place to end. And I think that's exactly where the document wants us. Not with answers, but with the discomfort of recognizing that the pattern is still active. One cafe, one intellectual failure, one chain of mentorship, and a world war. The next time someone presents you with a hypothesis dressed up as settled science, and someone will, remember Café Central. Remember that the people in that room thought they were the most enlightened minds of their age. They were wrong, and the world paid for it in blood.